Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I remember the night clearly, even though it feels like it was a lifetime ago. We had driven out from Banff just as the sky was fading to dark, heading up a forestry road that winds through the hills. Our plan was simple: reach a high ridge before sunrise and catch the light spilling over the mountains, capturing the mist in the valleys. The road was narrow, unmaintained, and lined with dense evergreens that pressed in from both sides. By the time we got a few miles in, it was pitch black, the only light coming from our headlights cutting through the frost-laced trees. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that makes your lungs sting with every breath, and the ground was frozen hard but rough enough that every bump sent the truck jolting. We had been joking, kind of nervously, about how isolated it felt. There were no other vehicles, no cabins, not even a faint glow from a distant town. The deeper we went, the narrower the road became, with ruts carved into the frozen dirt from previous trucks and logging equipment. Around midnight, just when we thought we were close enough to a good vantage point, the truck slid into a deep rut. The front tires sank slightly, and no matter how much we tried rocking it back and forth, it refused to budge. We were stuck. Cell service was non-existent, which made the situation feel even more isolating. The night seemed to close in, dark and heavy. After a few attempts to dig ourselves out and realizing we weren't getting anywhere, we resigned ourselves to waiting. There was no way to pull the truck free without help, and the nearest road that might have a signal was miles back. We decided to sleep in the cab until morning. I leaned back in my seat, pulling my jacket tight around me, trying to ignore the way the truck seemed swallowed up by the black forest around us. My buddy did the same, eyes half closed, the sound of the heater hissing faintly. I told myself I would rest, but sleep came fitfully. Every small sound outside seemed amplified in the still night. Around 3 a.m., I woke suddenly. My body stiff and my eyes snapping open, I heard something slow and deliberate moving outside. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the branches, but the sound was too measured. Heavy footsteps, crunching through the frost on the ground. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just a deer, or maybe a bear. The truck floorboard rattled lightly with every step outside, the shadows of the tall pines flickering against the cab. Then came a soft scrape along the side of the door, quiet, almost deliberate. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities, but nothing fit. Bears didn't walk on hind legs, and elk wouldn't creep up to your truck like that. My buddy, still half asleep, whispered for me to stay calm. We didn't speak beyond that. We watched through the windshield, hearts thudding in unison. A shadow moved, tall and broad, clearly human in shape. It didn't shine in the moonlight. It blended with the darkness, but the outline was unmistakable. It walked slowly to the tailgate, paused, and circled the truck once. Each step sounded heavier than the last, pressing into the frost. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the black line of trees that bordered the road. Neither of us slept after that. We stayed in the truck, the heater running to keep the chill off, straining our ears for any other sound. The night stretched endlessly. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made our hearts leap. But nothing else came. The forest remained quiet, almost too quiet, as if holding its breath along with us. By sunrise, the first weak light spilling over the ridges, we dared to step out. The frost clung to everything, and the air smelled of pine and frozen earth. I shivered as I took in the scene. Then I saw them, the prints. Boot prints in the frost, leading from the side of the road where we had been parked. Not hiking boots or modern sneakers, but old work boots with smooth soles, worn halfway down, as though someone had been using them for decades. The size was large, broader than mine or my buddy's, and the steps were uneven, almost lazy, like someone taking their time, confident they would not be seen. We followed the prints cautiously. They led down the forestry road for nearly 100 yards, weaving slightly with the contours of the road. The spacing between steps was long, purposeful, as though the person could cover ground easily. Then abruptly the prints stopped. They ended at the edge of the road, at the point where the forest thickened and the trees grew closer together. No continuation, no trail back into the trees, just a sudden disappearance. We looked at each other, unspoken fear in our eyes. Nothing in the forest explained it. No one had been working there, the road was too remote. It was unlikely anyone would have been walking out there at that hour. The size of the prints suggested a man, but the way they vanished made no sense. No tracks leading back, no snow displaced beyond the last print. It was as if someone had simply melted into the forest. We decided not to linger. The truck was still stuck, but with the morning light and some pushing, we managed to rock it free. Every time we glanced back at the spot where the prints ended, a cold sensation crawled up my spine. It wasn't fear of injury or attack, it was the absolute certainty that we had been watched. And whatever had been outside our truck had been patient, careful, and entirely capable of remaining unseen until it chose otherwise. We eventually made it back down the forestry road and returned to Banff, but the memory stayed with me. I thought about it constantly, the size, the silence, the way those prints ended. Months later, I did some research and asked local forestry workers if anyone had been known to walk that road at night. No one had. They warned of bears and cougars, but none of that fit. The description of the movements, the pacing, the way it seemed almost intelligent in its observation, didn't match any animal they knew. I never went back to that stretch of road, and I don't plan to. But I do know one thing clearly: someone or something had walked around our truck that night, and they had left no trace beyond the half-worn boots frozen into the frost. For years, I tried to rationalize it, telling myself maybe someone was camping nearby, or a lost hiker, or a hunter passing through. But the way it circled the truck, the way it disappeared without leaving a trail, made it impossible to fully explain. It wasn't a prank, and it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, and we were lucky to leave with nothing more than shaken nerves. The experience taught me to respect those roads, the forest, and the silence that hides things we can't always see. Every time I drive near a ridge at night now, I think about that frozen stretch outside Banff, and the quiet presence that moved through the frost, patient and watchful. The memory is as clear as the sunrise we eventually caught that morning, brilliant, cold, and quietly terrifying. The prints remain in my mind, the end of the trail as sharp and unsettling as the night we spent inside that truck, knowing we were being observed by something that might have been human, and might not have been. I remember that day on Goat Ridge Pass like it was burned into my memory. The air was thin and crisp, cold enough that every breath felt sharp in my lungs. The sky was a clear, almost unnatural blue, and the sun hit the granite slopes in a way that made the cliffs and ridges glow white, almost blinding in the distance. My friend and I had started early, parking at the tiny lot near the trailhead just after 7 a.m., the kind of lot where maybe 2 cars could fit if you were lucky. From there, the trail wound steeply up, rocky and narrow, cutting across the face of the mountain and offering drops that made my stomach clench every few minutes. We were hiking in silence for most of the morning, only talking when we needed to pass a difficult section or comment on a view. Goat Ridge Pass is remote. There are no real signs of civilization for miles. The trail is mostly used by serious hikers, climbers, and occasionally wildlife watchers. The rock is sharp and gray, a mix of shale and granite that clicks under boots and sometimes slides beneath your weight if you step wrong. Small pine trees clung to the slope, stubbornly surviving in the cracks and ledges, and the air smelled like pine resin and cold stone. Around mid-afternoon, we crested a ridge and looked down into a narrow valley below. That's when we noticed movement on the distant slope across from us. At first, we thought it was a mountain goat. They're common in that area, and the way it moved seemed familiar. But then, as it got closer to our line of sight, we realized something was off. The goat stood upright for a moment, and we both froze, looking at it in disbelief. It had the silhouette of a person, not a goat, but it was so far away that it took a moment for our minds to catch up. We laughed it off nervously, assuming it was another hiker far across the slope. Maybe someone trying to cut the trail or just lost. But we kept watching, curious. That's when the unease started. Every turn we made on the trail, the figure seemed to make the same turn. Every time we paused to adjust our packs or take a drink, it would pause. It was matching our movements exactly. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence, that perhaps we were only imagining it, but the more we walked, the more precise it became. By the time we found a place to set up camp just below the treeline, our joking had stopped. The campsite was on a small ledge, barely wide enough for 2 tents, surrounded by loose rocks and the occasional cluster of low shrubs. We had to clear a few larger stones from the ground before staking our tents, and I remember the sound of pebbles sliding down the slope below us, a faint clatter that echoed for a few seconds. We set up early, around 4 p.m., partly because the sun would disappear behind the ridge before 6, and partly because the air was already turning cold. We cooked our dinner on a small backpacking stove, the smell of boiling beans and burnt coffee filling the little clearing. The sky darkened faster than I expected, stars pricking through the twilight. I was awake around 2 a.m., though I'm not sure why. The wind had died down, leaving the night almost unnervingly still. That's when I first heard it, a faint click, like stones being nudged over each other. I froze, listening. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a goat. Mountain goats make that sound when they climb, knocking loose small rocks as they go. But these clicks weren't coming from below the ridge or the slope away from us. They were closer. They moved from one side of our camp to the other, slow, deliberate, almost cautious. I wanted to reach for my headlamp, but I was too aware of how exposed I was. The sound circled the tents, pausing here and there, stopping for a few seconds, then continuing again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every small sound, a snapping twig, a rock rolling, even the faint rustle of the wind through the pines, made me tense, waiting for the clicks to start again. By the time morning came, the first light brushing the peaks, I was exhausted and jittery. My friend was awake too, silently packing his tent, eyes darting around as if he had heard the same things I had. We left the tent standing for a moment and stepped out to take in the area. That's when we saw them. Footprints. They weren't deep, but they were unmistakably human, the outline of toes, arches, heels. They circled our campsite in a slow, irregular pattern, as if someone had been inspecting the tents from every angle. The prints were barefoot, pressed into the sharp shale, following a path that made no sense. Whoever it had been had moved silently, leaving these prints behind. There was no other gear, no discarded clothing, nothing. Just the footprints circling the tents and then trailing off toward the ridge. I traced one of the prints with my boot. It was shallow but solid, like someone had been careful to keep their weight light on the jagged stones. My stomach sank. Barefoot on that rock would have been painful, even impossible to walk on for any distance without stopping. Yet whoever it was had done exactly that. And they hadn't been far. They could have been watching us all night from a distance, maybe hiding behind rocks or trees. We packed up quickly and kept moving, scanning the slopes around us. Every small movement, every shadow seemed amplified. But we didn't see anyone. The trail back down was long, steep, and tense. Every now and then, we would glance at the ridge across from us, expecting to see that figure again, but the slope was empty. The valley below was quiet, only the occasional flutter of birds or the soft rustle of distant pines. When we finally got back to the trailhead, the parking lot was empty. No cars except ours, no signs of anyone else having been there that morning. No footprints except our own leading down the trail. We didn't speak much on the drive home, just kept looking at the road, the trees blurring past. I've thought about that night a lot since then. I wonder who or what had followed us. A lost hiker? A hermit living in the mountains? Someone who watches the trails and waits for people to pass? I'll never know. What I do know is that it wasn't an animal. The footprints, the careful barefoot steps on jagged rock, the way it matched our every movement across the slope. There's no other explanation. That night on Goat Ridge Pass changed the way I hike forever. I make sure someone knows my exact route. I carry bear spray, even where bears aren't common, and I never, ever set up camp without scouting the area thoroughly. I don't take the trails for granted anymore, and I don't assume I'm alone. Because sometimes, even in the most remote places, someone is watching. And they might be closer than you think, moving quietly over rocks, matching your steps, circling your tent, and disappearing without a trace when the sun comes up. We were descending from Iceberg Peak when the fog rolled in. It wasn't the usual thin mist that drifts over the lower slopes. This was thick, heavy, and cold, clinging to every surface and filling the spaces between the rocks. Within moments, it swallowed the trail completely. My boots sank slightly into loose scree, small stones shifting under my weight, and I realized I could barely see my own feet. The world around me had collapsed into gray nothingness. The ridge we'd been following earlier, the jagged cliffs, the distant patches of snow, all gone. Only the smell of wet stone and the metallic tang of melting snow filled my nose. I glanced at my friends, their faces just faint shadows through the fog. We had been careful all day, checking our map, marking points along the route, but now none of it mattered. Our GPS beeped occasionally, but each time we tried to get a reading, it froze or blinked in that hazy white void, useless. The wind cut across the slope, carrying a chill that settled deep into my bones. Every step required careful attention. The scree was loose, and one wrong step could mean tumbling down the slope. My hands instinctively moved to balance myself against the few boulders that rose out of the fog, cold and wet with condensation. Then I heard it. At first, I wasn't sure. A faint, rhythmic sound, clatter, clatter, clatter. Rocks bouncing, sliding, scraping against the slope. I froze. My heart jumped into my throat. It wasn't like a rock sliding down on its own. It had a cadence, deliberate, like someone was walking over the stones in long, careful steps. I lifted my head, straining to see through the fog, calling out. My voice sounded odd in the mist, muffled and small. We shouted again, louder this time, but the fog swallowed our words. Nothing answered. No echo, no reply, just that steady, relentless sound of stones clattering. We stopped moving. The sound stopped. I felt the silence press on me, heavier than the fog itself. We waited, ears straining, eyes trying to pierce the gray curtain. The air felt thicker, each breath a reminder of how isolated we were. The mountain, normally alive with the faint whistle of wind and the occasional cry of a bird, was mute. I could hear my heartbeat, slow and irregular, and the faint crunch of loose gravel beneath my boots. Then, almost as if the fog decided to grant us a moment of reprieve, it thinned slightly. Shapes emerged out of the gray, only faint at first, but then clearer. 50 yards up the slope, crouched on the rocks, was a figure. It was just a shape. No color, no detail, just a silhouette in the pale, diffuse light. It didn't move. Its posture was low, coiled, like it had been waiting for something. My first thought was some hiker, maybe someone lost like us, but there was something wrong. The figure's stillness was unnatural, deliberate. Every instinct screamed at me that it was watching us. We called out again, trying to break the tension, but it didn't respond. Then, without a sound, it turned and scrambled up the slope. Not a shout, not a crash of falling rocks. Just pure, smooth motion, moving faster than any human should be able to move over such treacherous scree. And then it was gone, swallowed again by the fog. We looked at each other, frozen. My mind raced. Who was it? Why had it been there? Why hadn't it answered? The fog hung around us for a long moment, thick and oppressive, until finally it began to thin again, retreating slowly up the slope. That's when we saw the tracks. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Big prints. Deep enough that whoever had made them must have been running at full speed. They led up the slope in the exact direction the figure had disappeared. We crouched, inspecting them. The dirt and rock had been soft enough in spots that the impressions were clear, like someone had hammered their feet into the mountain with every stride. I traced the prints with my gloved hand, shivering, because it didn't make sense. The angle was steep, the slope unstable. No one should be able to move like that over such terrain, barefoot, without slipping or falling. The realization hit me slowly. We weren't just lost. We weren't just in danger from the mountain itself. Something else had been here, watching, moving, and disappearing without a trace. We moved carefully, making sure every step was deliberate, silent, cautious. Our breaths were loud in the empty mountain air, and every snap of a stone underfoot made me jump. The scree field seemed to stretch endlessly, each boulder, each jagged edge magnified by the fog. Time slowed. We couldn't go up. The slope was steep, and we were trying to descend before dark. We couldn't go down without risking slipping off the scree field into loose rock fields below. Our only option was to move sideways along the contour, hoping to find a landmark, a tree, anything familiar. The fog didn't lift fully. It drifted around us, sometimes thin enough to glimpse the distant peaks, sometimes so thick that we couldn't see 5 feet in front of us. Every few steps, we would pause, listening for the clatter, for any sound of movement. Nothing came. The tracks of bare feet were the only proof that someone, or something, had been there. The silence pressed on us, dense and suffocating, but at least it meant the figure hadn't returned. Hours passed in that gray prison. Eventually, the fog thinned enough to reveal familiar markers. A twisted pine we had passed earlier, a large outcrop we had used to rest. Relief surged through me. The trail reappeared, faint but identifiable, carved in stone and marked by cairns. We followed it slowly, carefully, never taking our eyes off the rocks around us. The scree field that had felt endless now seemed just another obstacle, something we could overcome. I still kept thinking about the figure, crouched, watching. Whoever it was had moved with a purpose, and it had vanished almost without a trace. It didn't feel like it belonged in these mountains, not like an ordinary hiker. By the time we reached the base, the fog had lifted completely. The valley spread before us in the late afternoon sun, golden and calm, as if nothing had happened. We made it down safely, boots crunching over the familiar trail, sweat and fear still clinging to our clothes. I looked back once, half expecting to see that dark shape on the rocks, waiting again, but there was nothing. Only the mountains, indifferent, silent, and permanent. That night, in our camp, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The figure, the bare footprints, the impossible speed, the silence, it all stayed with me. None of us slept well. The mountain had tested us, not with weather or injury, but with the uncertainty of what might be out there, hidden in plain sight. We had survived, but the memory of being watched, helpless in the fog, stayed sharper than any cold or exhaustion. In the end, the clarity of the descent, the trail underfoot, and reaching the base gave me a sense of safety that almost erased the terror. Almost. The prints remained etched in my mind, and every time I think of Iceberg Peak, I remember the way the fog swallowed everything, and how it felt to be small and exposed under the watchful gaze of something moving silently on the mountain. The mountain itself had been the challenge, but that figure, whatever it had been, reminded me that even the most familiar places could hide dangers beyond understanding. We made it back to the parking area in the fading light, sun low and warm on our faces, hearts still racing but steady enough to pack the gear. I kept my eyes on the ridge as we drove away, scanning every shadow, every rock, half expecting to see a crouched shape watching us leave. Nothing appeared, and yet I knew, in a way I couldn't explain, that the mountain hadn't forgotten us, and we hadn't forgotten it. We were lucky. We had survived Iceberg Peak. But the memory of that fog, the sound of rocks sliding in rhythm, and the bare footprints chasing across the scree would stay with me forever. The mountain's silence, the invisible watcher, and the sudden clarity when the fog finally lifted. It all became part of the story I would carry for the rest of my life. I remember descending from Iceberg Peak like it was yesterday, though I hope I never have to relive it. The climb itself had been exhausting but straightforward. The morning had started crisp, with clear skies stretching across the horizon, the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks but wakes you up completely. We had made good time on the ascent, stopping only briefly to catch our breath and take in the staggering views, jagged peaks, frozen snowfields, and the occasional sheer drop that made my stomach turn. But by the time we started down, the weather had shifted in a way that made the mountain feel completely different, almost hostile. The fog rolled in slowly at first, a creeping gray that blurred the edges of the trail. By mid-afternoon, it had thickened into something nearly tangible. It wasn't just low-hanging clouds anymore. It was a wall of white that clung to the mountainside, heavy and cold. The scree field we were navigating stretched below us like a river of jagged stones, endless and treacherous. I could barely see my own boots, let alone the next step. Each footfall shifted loose rocks, and the scree slid in unpredictable ways, forcing me to move carefully. One wrong step could send me tumbling down a slope, and I knew it. We had been following the faint trail markers, little scratches on rocks, but the fog had swallowed them. My GPS beeped occasionally, but it was no use. The clouds interfered with the signal, and the readings bounced all over the place. My friend beside me, Alex, kept muttering under his breath, cursing our luck. There was no way to tell direction properly. Every rock and slope started to look the same in the whiteout. Time felt distorted, the sun invisible behind the dense clouds. The wind had picked up, cold and piercing, rustling at our jackets and whipping around our legs. It made the air hard to breathe, and the silence of the mountain feel heavier. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the rocks shifting beneath our boots, the scree settling. But then the sound became deliberate, rocks clattering in steady, rhythmic patterns. It wasn't random. It had a pace to it, like footsteps. I froze instantly, my heart hammering. Alex did too, and we exchanged a glance that didn't need words. Whoever, or whatever, was following us. We called out, our voices weak against the wind, shouting our presence, hoping whoever it was would know we weren't easy targets. There was nothing. The clattering stopped the moment we did. The silence was oppressive, almost physical, pressing against my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. We waited, listening. The wind howled around the peaks, but there was no sign of anyone moving again. Minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. Then the fog thinned slightly, enough for me to make out a figure crouched on the slope about 50 yards away. It It was strange, almost unreal. It didn't move, didn't show color, just a dark, crouched shape against the gray. My stomach turned. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no clothing. It simply watched. Not breathing audibly, not moving a muscle, just observing. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker, lost like us, or maybe a hunter from somewhere down the valley. Either way, there was no warmth in the shape, nothing familiar. It was too still, too deliberate. We shouted again, louder this time, hoping to scare it off or at least make it acknowledge us. That's when it moved. It didn't walk, it didn't run like a normal person. It scrambled up the slope with a speed that made my stomach flip, like the rocks didn't even slow it down. Not a single sound, no gravel shifting, no breath audible, nothing. Just movement, fluid and fast, disappearing into the fog as if it had melted into the clouds themselves. I blinked, thinking I had imagined it, but Alex was staring in the same spot, pale and frozen. The mountain returned to silence almost instantly. We stood there frozen, the fog still thick, our minds buzzing with adrenaline. We knew we had to keep moving, but the direction was uncertain. Our pace picked up, cautious at first, each step calculated. Every loose stone sounded like an alarm in my ears. The sun was invisible, the wind merciless, and the fog clung to our skin like wet wool. We descended slowly, using every instinct we had for balance, every ounce of experience on steep, scree-covered slopes. Our eyes constantly scanned the gray nothingness, expecting to see that same crouched shape emerge from nowhere. Every shadow, every shifting rock made us jump. When the fog finally began to lift as we approached a lower ridge, the landscape returned to familiar form, jagged rocks giving way to patches of hardy alpine grass, and then a distant tree line. It was relief so intense it left us both drained. But then I noticed something that stopped me cold. The ground near the last section of scree, just before the fog cleared completely, had fresh prints. Bare footprints. No shoes, nothing to protect the feet from the rocks, just deep impressions in the gravel and dirt. They were wide, showing someone had run with full force, maybe even sprinted straight up the slope at some point. The spacing suggested incredible speed, and the depth implied someone large, heavy, or running at full power. Whoever it was had the strength and fearlessness to run barefoot across jagged rock fields in near-zero visibility. The thought made me shiver. Alex and I examined the prints, heart still hammering, trying to make sense of it. There was no sign of a campsite, no abandoned gear, no discarded clothing. Nothing. Just footprints that led into the fog and disappeared. My mind refused to come up with a normal explanation. Maybe it was a local, someone used to surviving on these slopes, someone who moved like a mountain goat. But even then, running barefoot at that speed, in that terrain, with no sound, seemed impossible. My brain kept circling back to the figure crouched in the fog, the way it had watched us. It felt deliberate, like it had been studying us, waiting for something. The idea made me feel like prey, small and exposed on the mountain, even though there was nothing supernatural about it. It was just a person, but somehow worse because it was real and human, and we had no idea who or why. We followed the trail as best we could once the fog fully lifted, careful not to step in the prints. Every loose stone felt dangerous. The mountain seemed to exhale around us, wind pushing through the peaks, echoing like whispers of what had just happened. Eventually, we made it to a lower ridge where the trail became visible again, marked clearly and familiar. Relief flooded through both of us in a wave that left me lightheaded. I knew we had been lucky, stupidly lucky, to survive that fog, that scree, and whatever had been watching us. The figure never came close, never threatened us directly, but the raw presence of it, silent and fast, left a mark in my mind that won't go away. We made it down to the base of the mountain as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky with orange and pink streaks. Exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, we finally reached the trailhead where the cars were parked. I kept looking back toward the slopes, half expecting to see that crouched shape again, but there was nothing. Just the quiet mountain, indifferent and cold. We drove away in silence, adrenaline still humming in our veins. The memory of the barefoot tracks burned into my mind. That day I learned something about mountains, about being watched, about how fast danger can move, and how real fear is when the only evidence is footprints and the sudden, uncanny silence of the world around you. Even now, thinking about it, I can feel the chill of the fog, the weight of being observed, and the lingering question of who, or what, we saw that day on Iceberg Peak. We never spoke about it again, not really. Some things, I think, don't need words. We survived, we got down, and the mountain kept its secret. And somehow that's enough. I rented a small cabin in the backcountry near Mount Washington for a weekend riding trip. I wanted to escape the city, get away from the constant noise and people, and just focus on my work. The cabin itself was small, just one room, a loft, a wood stove, and a tiny kitchen area. It sat alone on a slope, surrounded by dense pines and firs. The caretaker had warned me when I arrived, "Don't wander after dark. Visibility's bad." I nodded, thinking it was just common sense. I didn't pay much attention to it. The sun was setting as I unpacked my bags, the sky streaked with orange and purple. It was cold, colder than I'd expected for early November, but not unbearably so. I chopped some wood, got the stove going, and settled in with my laptop and notebooks, ready to write. The first night after dinner, I fell into the usual routine, typing, pausing, staring out the window at the dark shapes of the trees and the mountains beyond. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. The trees were creaking, snow occasionally landing on the roof in little avalanches. But this was different. It was a faint tapping on the window. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was some branch scraping against the glass. Then it came again, steady, deliberate, like knuckles rapping. I sat up in bed and stared. My window faced the slope behind the cabin, a blank expanse of white and shadow. I reached over and pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. Just snow, trees, and the dark mountain beyond. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing else. I went back to bed, telling myself it was an animal, a piece of ice falling, something ordinary. I tried to shake off the unease and fell asleep. In the morning, the sun was weak, the sky gray and overcast. I went to the window to pour coffee, and my heart stopped. There, pressed into the thin layer of snow that had fallen on the cabin's sill, were prints. Bare fingers, small but distinct, smudged across the glass. They looked human, clear as day. I knelt down, tracing them with my eyes. There was no snow around the cabin that could have explained them. No footprints, no tracks from animals, nothing. The nearest house, the caretaker had said, was 7 miles away down the ridge. That meant it would have taken a person at least an hour to hike here, even on a clear day, and at night with snow and ice even longer. My hands shook as I finished my coffee. I packed quickly, double-checked the cabin, and stepped outside, hoping the cold morning light would make me feel safer. The snow was soft and deep, fresh overnight. I followed the snowmobile track that had led me to the cabin, heading down the slope toward the road where my truck was parked. The woods were silent. No birds, no animals, just the faint crunch of snow under my boots. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe someone had been hiding nearby, a prankster or some lost hiker. But the prints were too deliberate, too precise, like someone had deliberately pressed their hands against the glass and held them there. My stomach churned as I walked faster, wanting to put distance between myself and the cabin. About halfway down, the slope leveled out into a small clearing, and I saw the frozen pond. It had a thin layer of ice, uneven and shimmering in the weak morning light. My boots crunched over the snow as I approached it, and that's when I saw them. More handprints. Same size, same spacing. Pressed into the ice along the edge of the pond, as if someone had knelt down and tested the surface. There was no one there, not a soul, but the prints were unnervingly clear. The fingers were splayed slightly, each impression deep enough to make me wonder how heavy or strong the person had been. I stood there for a long time, staring, listening. The forest was still. The snow fell lightly from the trees, but there was no other sound. No movement, no tracks leading away from the pond. It was impossible. There was no way anyone could have reached the cabin, pressed their hands against the window, and wandered out here in the middle of the night without leaving footprints. And yet the evidence was right there. I kept moving, not looking back. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. Every sound, the wind through the trees, a branch snapping under its own weight, made me jump. I forced myself to focus on the path and the truck waiting down the hill. The snowmobile tracks guided me like a lifeline. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were numb, and I was shaking from cold and adrenaline. I slid inside, locked the doors, and just sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. I had planned to stay another night, maybe write a bit more, but that idea evaporated. I started the engine, the rumble echoing in the silent clearing, and drove down the narrow road, the headlights cutting through the low-hanging clouds of snow. The rest of the drive was tense. Every shadow at the edge of the road, every tree, seemed to hold some unseen presence. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following, though I knew it was impossible. When I finally reached the main road and the familiar stretch of pavement that led to the nearest town, I felt a little lighter, a little safer. But even then, the image of those prints, their sharp clarity in the snow, pressed into glass, pressed into ice, stayed with me. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to find an explanation. An animal? Impossible. Ice shifting? Too deliberate. Someone playing a prank? Too remote. It made no sense. And yet, I could not unsee it. Back in town, I called the caretaker. I asked if anyone had ever been up there before. He said yes, hikers, snowmobilers, the occasional photographer, but none had ever reported anything like what I described. He didn't offer theories. He just reminded me that visibility was bad. Snow and ice could create illusions, but even that sounded hollow. I didn't mention the handprints in the ice. It felt wrong, unreal, even though I had seen it. I didn't want to sound crazy, not to him, not to myself. I decided to write about the experience later, once I had processed it, maybe as fiction. But the truth was, it didn't feel like fiction. The memory of those prints, clear and precise, stayed with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see them pressed into glass and ice, and it made my skin crawl. I haven't gone back. I've returned to the mountains, but never near that area. I told myself it was a one-time thing, something strange and isolated. I convinced myself I had imagined parts of it, though not the prints. No imagination could make bare fingers press so clearly into snow and ice. I don't know who, or what, had left them or why. But I know that whatever it was, it had been close enough to touch the cabin in the dead of night, and it had been patient, deliberate, silent. I keep my trips to the backcountry closer to towns now, places where I can see other people, places where footprints make sense. I still think about that cabin and the pond, and sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I wonder if anyone else has seen those prints. I don't want to find out. And I've learned that some parts of the mountains are best left undisturbed. Some things are best left unseen. And that even in the bright light of day, there are corners of the world where the ordinary rules simply do not apply. The memory lingers, more vivid than any story I've written, a warning I'll never forget. I remember the descent from Iceberg Peak like it was a nightmare stretched into slow motion. We had started early that morning, the sky clear and cold, the air sharp with that icy mountain edge that makes your lungs burn with every breath. The peak itself was breathtaking, a mixture of jagged rock and snowfields that glinted in the early sunlight. We had been careful up to that point, each step calculated, each handhold tested. But coming down was supposed to be easier. At least, that's what we thought. By late afternoon, clouds had been creeping in, but it didn't seem alarming at first. Just wisps of white rolling through the ridges. We pushed on, focused on the scree, and the way the wind could push against you unpredictably. Then, almost without warning, the fog hit. It came down like a wall, dense, cold, and suffocating. One moment we could see 50 feet ahead. The next, it was our boots and nothing else. The scree field, which had seemed manageable, now looked infinite. The rocks beneath our feet shifted with each step, tiny avalanches of gravel rolling into the voids between larger stones. I could hear nothing but the crunching of our boots and the occasional slap of a glove against a rock as someone tried to steady themselves. The trail we had been following disappeared completely. I pulled out the GPS, hoping it could guide us, but the fog was so dense the signal faltered, flickering uselessly. I realized how completely isolated we were. The kind of isolation you can only feel when you are above the treeline, surrounded by sheer cliffs, and the world has shrunk to the size of a few square feet of visibility. My stomach tightened, not with fear yet, but with that cold awareness of vulnerability. Every shadow, every sound felt amplified. And then I heard it. The first rocks clattered somewhere above us. A light, rolling sound that could have been another hiker, but there was a rhythm to it, deliberate and steady. Footsteps. Not just rocks sliding, but rocks being kicked by someone moving. I froze. The others froze. Our eyes darted around blindly, trying to pierce the fog. The clattering continued, slow but purposeful. I shouted, hoping my voice would reach whoever it was, but there was no response. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, a drum against the quiet of the fog. And then, as soon as we stopped shouting, the sound stopped. Not gradually, like someone pausing, just dead silent. The kind of silence that makes your stomach drop because it means something is watching, and it knows you've noticed. We stood there for what felt like forever. I could see only the closest rocks, my gloved hands brushing against cold stone to keep my balance. My friend a few feet away was tense, shoulders hunched, scanning blindly. I wanted to convince myself it was an animal, a goat maybe, or just loose scree shifting. But my gut refused to let me settle on that. This felt different. Human. Intentional. After what seemed like an eternity, the fog thinned just enough for me to make out a figure. 50 yards away, crouched low on the slope. It didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, or at least I couldn't see it blink. It was a silhouette, darker than the fog around it, but I could make out the broad outline of a body. There was no color, no detail, just the unmistakable shape of someone watching. My heart slammed against my ribs. I shouted again, louder this time, but the figure didn't respond. It didn't flinch. Then, without a sound, it scrambled up the slope. Not climbing, not carefully stepping, running, almost gliding over rocks, moving fast and silently. And just like that, it was gone, swallowed by fog that rolled back over the scree like a curtain. We didn't move for a long time. None of us breathed. The tension was so thick, I could feel it pressing down on my shoulders. Slowly, cautiously, we began descending again, keeping our eyes on the fog ahead and around. The scree that had felt endless before now felt treacherous in a new way, each rock a potential slip, each shadow a hiding place. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure reappear, to see it following us down the slope, but there was nothing. Only fog and rock and the sound of our own cautious movements. When the fog lifted a little more, we could see prints. At first, I didn't believe it. Boots, I thought, maybe another hiker had gone ahead in the fog. But no, these were not boots. The impressions were shallow at first glance, but clearly the shape of bare feet. Long, deep, with the heel and ball pressed hard into the rock and soil. They led directly up the slope, the same way the figure had vanished. What struck me was the depth. Whoever it was had been running at full speed. Barefoot. Across rocks, loose scree, cold and unforgiving. It was impossible, and yet there they were, every step marked in the dirt, pressed deep as if gravity had wanted to leave a permanent record. I crouched, brushing my glove against one of the prints. The edges were crisp, as if the person had only just passed. The earth had barely settled. My mind raced. Whoever it was had incredible skill, or desperation. We followed the prints for a short stretch, curious and terrified at the same time, but the slope became unstable. Rocks shifted beneath our feet, and the fog closed in again. We realized tracking them wasn't safe. The rational part of my brain screamed to leave, and that's what we did. Step by careful step, we descended, paying close attention to every sound, every subtle change in the ground beneath us. Every crack of a stone, every rush of wind made me tense. I kept thinking about those bare feet, how impossible it was to move that fast across the mountain. Whoever it was had vanished into the peak's shadow, leaving only proof that they had existed. We never saw the figure again, but the prints were a reminder that something had been there. Something human, but unlike any hiker I had ever imagined. By the time we reached the tree line, the fog had lifted entirely. The mountain was silent, normal almost, as if it had never been a stage for terror. We found the trail again, marked clearly by cairns we had missed before. The prints ended abruptly at a narrow ledge near a small creek, as if whoever it was had jumped or stepped down carefully, leaving no trace beyond that point. I examined the area, looking for any signs of struggle, a backpack, anything. Nothing. Only disturbed gravel and the faint scent of damp earth. We moved faster after that, not reckless, but driven by the memory of those silent footsteps, by the feeling of being watched. The descent continued without incident, the sun slipping lower in the sky, turning the mountain's snowfields pink. By the time we reached the base, the fear had dulled to a tense awareness. We told ourselves it was someone just like us, maybe a local, maybe a hiker used to the terrain, and that was the end of it. But even then, the memory of those prints stayed with me. The shape in the fog, crouched and still, the impossibility of moving barefoot across jagged scree. It felt unreal, but every footprint told the truth. It had happened, and I had survived. Looking back now, months later, I understand that the mountain itself wasn't dangerous. The danger was human. Someone capable, patient, willing to watch, to wait, to vanish like smoke into the fog. I've been back to the peak since, with better maps, GPS, and more experience, but I never forget that day. Every step on scree makes me think of that figure. Every foggy ridge I see, I remember that impossibly fast movement, those bare feet, and the quiet, predatory awareness that someone was there. And in a strange way, that memory has made me a better hiker, more cautious, more respectful of the mountain, and more aware that sometimes the most dangerous things are not the snow, the rocks, or the weather, but other people, moving unseen, watching, and disappearing without a trace. I was driving along the Blue Ridge Parkway near Craggy Gardens, late at night, around 1 in the morning. The road was almost completely empty, the kind of emptiness that presses on you after a while. The winding switchbacks seemed to go on forever, lit only by the yellow glow of my headlights cutting through the black. The air smelled crisp and cold, carrying hints of pine and wet earth from an earlier rain. I had the windows cracked a little, just enough to hear the soft whistle of the wind as it passed by. Normally, that kind of night would feel peaceful, almost hypnotic, but that night it had a strange, uneasy edge. As I rounded a sharp turn, I noticed headlights behind me. At first, I thought it was just another car, maybe someone else driving the parkway late like me. It wasn't unusual for night drivers to take the scenic route, though it was rare this late. I glanced at my rearview mirror, the lights flickering through the curves behind me, and I felt a small jolt of relief. Someone was there, sharing the road. I let my foot off the gas slightly, expecting them to either pass or follow at their own pace. But the headlights didn't move closer. No matter how fast I went or how slow I drove, they stayed the same distance back. Not changing, not reacting, just steady. I adjusted my speed several times to see if I was imagining it. I sped up, and they stayed the same distance. I slowed down, and again the same. The switchbacks of the parkway seemed to stretch endlessly, the curves winding up and down through the dark. My stomach started twisting in a way it hadn't in a long time. Something didn't feel right. After a few more minutes of driving, the lights were still there, exactly where they had been. I decided to pull off at an overlook, a wide spot where a wooden guardrail offered a view of the mountains below. I stopped, put the car in park, and sat quietly listening. The night was absolutely still, except for the faint sound of wind brushing through the trees and the occasional chirp of a cricket somewhere in the distance. I got out of the car and walked to the edge of the overlook. My shoes crunched on the gravel, echoing oddly in the emptiness. I scanned the road behind me. Nothing. No lights. No car. Nothing at all. I stood there for several minutes, staring down into the black valley below, trying to convince myself that it had just been my eyes playing tricks, some weird reflection of my own headlights, or maybe another car that had gone around the bend and disappeared. But as I returned to the car and drove slowly back onto the road, there they were again. The headlights, back in the exact same place behind me, gliding over the curves of the switchbacks. I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was probably a maintenance vehicle or a construction truck running behind schedule. The parkway was known for occasional late-night work, though seeing a crew this late was rare. I kept driving, paying attention to every curve, every dip, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tight. The headlights never got closer. They never fell behind. It was as if they were frozen in place, mirroring my every movement perfectly. By now, my heart was racing. Every mile felt longer than it should have. The fog had started rolling in lightly, drifting across the road and through the trees, making the headlights appear diffuse, glowing but without a solid source. Shadows moved in the corner of my vision, but every time I looked, there was nothing. I felt trapped on that road, like I was in some strange loop. I passed the usual pull-offs, the places I had stopped countless times during daylight trips. Normally, these overlooks offered spectacular views of the valleys and ridges, but at night, all I could see was darkness stretching for miles. I tried to focus on the road, on the center line, anything to keep my mind from panicking. The headlights stayed there, steady, persistent. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I started descending toward Asheville. The road straightened a little, the curves becoming less frequent, and the forest thinned. The headlights remained behind me, the same distance, no change, as if they were glued to my car. My anxiety was building, my knuckles white around the wheel, every instinct telling me something was wrong. Finally, I reached a gas station just off the parkway. Relief washed over me in a small wave as I parked under the bright, buzzing lights. I could feel the tension slowly leaving my shoulders as I turned off the car and sat for a moment. I watched the dark road behind the station. No headlights, no vehicles, nothing at all. It was normal now, quiet, just the distant hum of the town at night. I went inside the station, needing confirmation, something to ground me. I asked the clerk quietly if anyone had been reported driving on the parkway that night, especially near Craggy Gardens. His face was blank for a second before he shook his head. The road had been closed since 10 that night for construction. No vehicles were supposed to be on that stretch at all. I left the station with that thought weighing heavily on me. There was no logical explanation for what I had seen. No headlights should have been there, no vehicle following me in that impossible way. The road had been closed. Yet, the feeling I had on that winding stretch of switchbacks, the unnatural consistency of those lights, was burned into my mind. I took the longer, more well-lit roads back to my apartment, avoiding the parkway entirely. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting the same lights to appear again, but they never did. I told myself it was probably a hallucination, maybe my mind playing tricks from fatigue and darkness, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something about the way the lights moved, or didn't move, was too deliberate, too steady to be imagined. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the image of those headlights. Every time I thought about driving at night, especially on deserted mountain roads, I felt that same uneasy knot in my stomach. I checked online, read reports, anything I could find about accidents or sightings on that part of the parkway. Nothing. No one else reported seeing lights or vehicles. Eventually, I came to a quiet conclusion. Whatever I had seen that night was real, at least in its effect on me. It had no explanation I could accept, no easy rational answer. It wasn't a ghost, a prank, or anything supernatural. It was simply an event, a reality that didn't make sense in ordinary terms, and it had left its mark. The memory of it still lingers whenever I drive in the dark, a reminder that some things on the road can't be predicted, explained, or fully understood. I never drove the parkway near Craggy Gardens at night again. I stick to daylight trips now, keeping the windows down and the radio on, just to feel less alone. The mountains are beautiful in the day, safe in a way the night is not. And every time I think back to that drive, I can still picture those headlights, steady, distant, and impossible, forever fixed behind me on the dark curves of the switchbacks. The memory isn't frightening in a traditional sense. It's the quiet certainty that, even in a world governed by rules and logic, there are moments when reality itself seems to bend just enough to make you question everything. That night didn't end with an answer. It ended with clarity. The world is bigger than you can see, and sometimes, what follows you doesn't need to make sense to be real. The morning air was crisp and biting as my brother and I set off, splitboards strapped to our backs, leaving the small town of Crested Butte behind. The sky was clear, pale blue, and the snow glistened under the weak November sun. The backcountry outside the official boundaries was quiet, almost too quiet, like it was holding its breath. We had checked the avalanche report that morning, moderate risk, and I remember the way my stomach tightened when I read it. I knew it wasn't safe, not really, but the pull of the untouched slopes was too strong. It always is, when you're chasing the first tracks and the silence of snow that hasn't been disturbed. The climb started easy enough. The snow beneath our boots was packed in some spots, soft in others. We were careful, moving slowly, scanning the slope above and around us, checking for any signs of instability, cracks, hollow sounds underfoot, little slides that might have already gone. I carried my beacon in a pocket, probe and shovel in the pack, but none of that mattered if the mountain decided to move. It's a harsh reality you carry in the backcountry. The snow doesn't negotiate, it just goes. Halfway up the gulch, the snow changed beneath me. It was subtle at first, a slight hollow feeling with each step, almost like walking over a weak roof. Then I felt it, a deep, muffled whump under my boots. It wasn't loud, but it reverberated through my legs, a hollow, slow sound that made my stomach clench. My brother froze beside me, his face tightening as he looked down at the snow. I told him to go slow, one at a time. It was instinct, the only way to reduce weight on the slope and hope that nothing shifted beneath us. He took 2 more steps. I remember watching his boots press into the snow, the way it didn't feel solid anymore. Then it happened. The snow under him cracked in a perfect spiderweb, radiating outward from where he stood. I didn't have time to scream. The mountain moved before I could even process it. He vanished in a roar of white, the sound like thunder muffled by cotton. I lunged forward, my hands scrabbling at a pine tree nearby, gripping the rough bark with white-knuckled fingers as the wave of snow surged to my chest. I dug my feet into the slope, trying to anchor myself, but the snow was relentless, cold and heavy, pressing against me from every side, filling my nose and mouth. The world had reduced to white in weight and panic. When the avalanche finally stopped, there was silence. Absolute silence, except for the faint settling of snow around me. The air hung thick with snow dust, shimmering in the sunlight, and I coughed, trying to clear the icy powder from my lungs. My hands and face were numb, but adrenaline kept me moving. I had to find him. I started digging with my hands at first, clawing at the snow, moving methodically, kicking chunks out of the way. My fingers were raw in minutes, but I couldn't stop. Every second mattered. Every second that passed made survival less likely. I dug for an hour. The snow was dense, packed down by the weight of the slab, and it refused to give up its hold easily. My brother's pack strap caught my hand first, torn and half buried, then a glove, 15 feet downslope, marking the path of where he had been swept. I followed every trace, every subtle depression in the snow that might tell me where he was lying. The snow had taken him down a small chute, not far, but enough that my path of digging was uphill from where he lay. Finally, I found him face down, completely still. Panic twisted in my chest for a moment before I checked for breathing, finding a faint rise and fall in his chest. He was alive, but barely half buried and exhausted from the suffocating pressure of the slab. It took both of us, digging and pushing against the weight, to get him free enough to breathe properly. My fingers were bleeding, and snow clung to my hair, my clothes, my eyes, but we worked in silence. There was no room for panic. We couldn't afford it. When he was finally upright, I could see the bruises forming along his ribs, the raw cold burning his skin. The shock was evident in the way he shivered uncontrollably, teeth chattering, yet still conscious. We wrapped him in the extra layers I had in my pack, using the tarp and whatever insulation we could find. Every movement was careful, deliberate, because the slope above us still looked unstable. The mountain didn't care about us, and we couldn't assume it was done moving. By the time the rescue team arrived, hours later, we were exhausted. They confirmed what I already knew. The slab had been precariously balanced, waiting for just one more ounce of weight to give way. A single misstep, and the outcome could have been fatal for both of us. The team helped us down, checking vitals, giving first aid, but the mountain behind us still loomed, silent but threatening. My brother stayed wrapped in blankets, his face pale but calm, too exhausted to speak much. I kept my eyes on the slope, replaying every second, every sound, every hollow thump beneath my boots. I knew I would never hear that muffled, low sound of shifting snow again without remembering the slab that tried to swallow us. The drive back to town was quiet. My brother leaned against the seat, trying to shake off the lingering adrenaline, while I stared out the window at the mountains, snow glinting in the fading light. The danger was real, but we had been lucky. That luck wasn't something to flaunt or forget. It was fragile, like a thread stretched over a cliff, and it could snap in an instant. Weeks later, I still think about that day. Every time I step into deep snow, I feel that same hollow give under my boots, and my pulse jumps. The memory isn't just in my head. It lives in my body, in the tightness of my chest when I hear the snow settling in silence, in the way my hands tighten instinctively around a tree or my poles. I replay the spiderweb crack, the roar of snow, the moment my brother vanished in front of me. It's vivid, sharp, unavoidable. I've gone back into the backcountry since then, of course. It's impossible not to if the mountains call to you. But I go slower now, more aware, checking slopes with an almost obsessive attention to detail. I read every report, watch every sign, listen for that faint hollow beneath my feet. I don't take unnecessary risks anymore. That day taught me the weight of the snow, the patience of the mountain, and the fragility of life when faced with it. My brother and I survived, but not without learning how close we were to not making it at all. And every time I hear snow shift quietly beneath me, I remember the slab waiting, the roar, the silence, and the hour I spent digging, clawing, refusing to give up. That day ended with us alive, bruised, cold, but determined to respect the mountain, to respect the quiet danger that waits silently, always ready. It's a lesson I carry with me, in every slope, every gulch, every step on snow that can't be trusted, a lesson I will never forget.